Hello and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason, and with me as usual is Rich. Hello, Rich.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. Better than the Clippers, I would say.
Yeah, it's not going well for them again. No. Which
yeah. Well, I guess relatively speaking, historically, it's actually going pretty well for them. But
yes, I was going to say, like, you know, it might seem like it's always going bad for them, but it's actually gone pretty well. But then again, it seems like it's gone pretty bad, which is unique for the Clippers.
It's an interesting place to be in, for sure. So, yes, they have joined an illustrious club of teams that have won at least 50 games for 5 straight seasons, also had an SRS of 3 or better during that time, but did not make the finals. There are only 3 other teams that have accomplished that, and accomplished in quotes, of course, and even in 2 of those cases, those 2 teams did actually make the finals, just not in that 5-year window. So it's
right.
I mean, I guess in theory the Clippers could always, bring themselves back and could, or could just make some clever trades or whatever and could maintain some excellence and eventually make a finals. But right now they're in this club.
Yeah, and it's unique with the Clippers as well, and I feel like we kind of felt it with these other teams that we're going to talk about a little bit, but with the Clippers, it seems so they're just surrounded by it always seems like failure. You know what I mean? Like where a little bit of these teams, it's like, oh, that's pretty cool what they're getting here. Like the one team in particular we're going to talk about, it was a team that people regarded as always there, but oh man, they just couldn't do it because of X, or they just couldn't do it because of that. Whereas the Clippers, being in this class with these other teams that we'll talk about here in a sec, it just always felt like nobody really enjoyed the Clippers thing. Everybody always thought it sucked. Everybody always thought it failed. Like, and that's like, cause it was always like a fun experience, and on paper it was always fun, and there would be periods where the Clippers were fun, but every time come playoffs, it was just like, oh God, here we go. Here are the Clippers doing their Clippers things or whatever. And then they lose and everyone go, yeah, of course they lost. So it was always kind of weird to see that where they were in this, and that, I don't know if you or I or many people would assume that they would be on this list, or that they had such success for so many years and been this elite club of a team that has been very good for so long. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end of the show about teams as well that have had really historically great runs, and they're right there with those teams. So it's just interesting because the optics don't feel like that. It always felt like the Clippers were just like a failure, when in actuality they were a very good team for a lot of years. It just couldn't get over the hump one way or another, and it probably is because of some of the reasons of how they lost and how and the circumstances of their losses probably did a little bit more than it did for a few of these other teams that we'll talk about.
Yeah, and personalities are a big part of it as well. Like Chris Paul is not liked by a lot of people for how he reacts to things on the court, and how he's always it seems like he's always being mean or berating somebody or doing things like that. And I feel like they have quite a few divisive personalities in their team for whatever reason, and just like kind of the way they conduct themselves. And there's a lot of interesting things going on there. Doc Rivers is another personality that is divisive, I would say, is a fair way to put it. So, and you were getting into this, but the way the Clippers have lost, they according to ESPN Stats and Info, they have now been eliminated in a series they've once led 5 straight years in a row, which is yeah,
that probably contributes to some of the feeling of failure too, because it's like you were there all these times, just win the series. But yeah, it never quite happened for him. But yeah, and it could be disappointment too, because on paper they look like a team that should at least contend, or at least make a conference final or make an NBA final or whatever. But for one reason or another, it just never quite happened. But yeah, personality plays a huge part in this as well. I think the other teams we're going to talk about all had, I think, more positive personalities than this team, which I think the historically are going to go down as a team that most people were going to say, yeah, at the time, not many people liked them really. So
right, yeah, and it's bad for Clippers fans who have waited for so long to have a team that was this good to root on, and like I said, in their history, we've had episodes going back into their history and how bad they were, and for them to have these successful years, averaging about 55 wins per season, 5.81 SRS over the past 5 seasons, which is really good. That is, teams like that often win championships, often win finals. Again, it's rare that a team won't do that in this case. So almost anyone would ask for that success, but the way that it has happened has been, like I said, rough on those teams. And it's a combination of things. A lot of it has been injuries. We'll kind of break down a few of those. There was a Donald Sterling situation, which actually should have made them sympathetic, and I think brought them some sympathy for a while because they were battling under this very emotional situation where everyone hated the owner, the players hated the owner, and wanted, even considered not playing a game in protest, and there was all these things going on. But for whatever reason, they didn't really emerge from that much more sympathetic than beforehand. So it's been bizarre how everything has happened. But we'll get into a little bit of it. What were you going to say, Rich?
Oh, no, that was about it. Of just, the optics of the Clippers are just always been kind of fascinating, too. And, they should have been sympathetic, and they were, like you said, they absolutely were for a little while after the Donald Sterling. And then Chris Paul probably just, threw a temper tantrum in the corner. Everybody's like, never mind, I don't like this team. Or Blake Griffin punched a trainer or something like that. Everyone's like, actually, I don't really like these guys. Yeah. So, we all wanted them to win for, 2 months, and then we're like, actually. Because, I'll secret, I won't lie. You kind of had this idea for the show before the Clippers had been eliminated, and I really was hoping they got eliminated because it was a really good idea for a show. And I knew at some point they were probably going to get eliminated, but I'm glad that it happened when it did, and it happened in such Clippers fashion too, because they probably should have beat the Jazz. I mean, there was Gordon Hayward was out a bunch of times, Rudy Gobert barely played, and it's just they still couldn't do it. And then losing the way they did in that game 7-2 was perfect too, because it was just they never had a chance.
No, and they lost Blake Griffin in that series, so they had some disadvantages as well.
And but that always happens to them too, which is always the unfortunate thing too, is you just wonder at what point if they ever just had a season where everybody was healthy, but at the same point they never had, sometimes it becomes a pattern. When Blake Griffin gets hurt every single year, you can't always go, oh man, Blake's hurt, oh, what are we going to do? He gets hurt. That's just kind of a Blake Griffin thing that happens.
Right. Lately, last 3 years, I think he's been hurt all those times. So unfortunately for him. And I think the only beloved player, really universally beloved player there that's been there for most of that run is Jamal Crawford. Everyone loves Jamal Crawford. So,
If you hate Jamal Crawford, you're just a bad person. So
don't listen to the show. Turn it off.
Right now. I mean, subscribe to us on iTunes, give us a good review, and then turn it off and never listen again. So
your listening privilege has been revoked. Yes. JJ Redick's from Duke. They just aren't generally likable personalities.
When you go down the list too, they don't really I feel like there's two players I like. It's Jamal Crawford, and then I'm thinking of the historic, this Clippers teams over the last 4 or 5 years. I don't really know that I like. I like Chris Paul, but he's kind of a pud. But,
I like Chris Paul out as a player, but I get why people don't like him.
And then they had Matt Barnes for all those years.
Oh
I guess
Blake's really fun to watch. He's really exciting.
Just as a person. Austin Rivers. Right. I mean, nobody likes Austin Rivers. And I guess I have nothing against Luke Richard and Mute, but...
Right.
But, it's 4 or 5 guys that I really don't like on that team.
Sure.
Hey, whatever.
So, their best chance at a championship, and again, they've never made a conference finals, which is remarkable given, even more remarkable than the other teams all did. That's kind of hard to say. I would say probably their best team was 2014. They lost to the Thunder in the second round, who were awesome that year. Obviously, peak of Westbrook and Durant powers. They would have had to battle the Spurs in their last championship season, or and then of course the Heat if they had made the finals. So that would have been very difficult. But even getting to the finals would have been hard. And this was also the year that they dealt with the Donald Sterling controversy. So really, they did not necessarily have a great chance. They did blow a 13-point lead with 4 minutes left in Game 5 in the Thunder series, which Chris Paul committed a key. Turnover also blew a big lead in Game 6. So kind of some of the usual Clipper shenanigans. 2015, they famously had a 3-1 lead over the Rockets before losing that series after beating the Spurs in a classic first round. But it would have been really hard for them to beat the Warriors, I think, in the next round. And in 2016, they looked like briefly they had an opening after the Warriors lost Steph Curry. It looked like he might be out long term. But then they immediately lost Chris Paul and Blake Griffin to injury in the series against the Blazers, and then you didn't even win that series. So so I don't think they've really ever had a great chance at the ultimately blew, which is kind of every year something happened. I mean, some of those series they should have lost, and some of them in fact most of them they probably should have lost. Probably the one that they shouldn't have lost would have been blowing the 3-1 lead against the Rockets. Yeah,
absolutely. It was actually kind of, I don't know if you saw the stat earlier, but you mentioned that conference finals thing. Someone brought it up that there's only 2 franchises that have in the West that have not made a conference final since the year 2000. Did you see that one?
I did, yes.
Yeah, and and then I kind of was going through, and I was like, well, what about? Oh, yeah, and then like it was kind of interesting to go through, and then you don't realize how in we talk about how little parity there is, and but like that's a lot of parity, and in terms of 16 years, every single team except for the Clippers, just to spoil it was the Los Angeles Clippers and New Orleans, the Pelicans / Hornets were the only two teams that had not made it there, so it was kind of interesting to see that, and just realize that as much as we kind of complain about, or we don't, but a lot of the comment is like, oh, there's no parity. The conference finals have been very open. Yeah, as far as getting to the NBA finals, that's a little bit rare, but at least getting there. And I judge, if you get to the conference finals, I think you've had a damn good season. Like, yes, maybe you didn't make it to the NBA finals, maybe you didn't win an NBA championship, but the conference, that's a big deal. I mean, you really are head and shoulders above a lot of people, or you've had a really good playoff run too, which I think we should reward a little bit more than we do, because we kind of go title or nothing. Like, which, you and I don't. We're very anti that on this show, but I feel like by and large, conference finals don't really get the love that they probably should.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an accomplishment. I mean, what the Clippers honestly have accomplished has been a good accomplishment. I mean, they've had a really good run by NBA standards. It's just, the weirdness and maybe just the way the team is made up, whether it's the personalities, whether it's kind of the on-court fit together. There's sort of been the top three are very talented, but it never really like meshed that well. It seems like they've sometimes played better. Like when Paul was out, Griffin would play better. When Griffin was out, Paul and DeAndre would play better. It was the fit between the three of them, despite obviously great talent, and the development of Jordan and Griffin over the years has been great, but it seems like it's never quite fit together. We kind of talked about some of the personality stuff, and the pieces around them. I think the most notable failures they've had, besides that 3-1 lead to the Rockets, would be GM Doc Rivers of making some really moves that were not great. I mean, you could argue the trade, Eric Bledsoe and Caron Butler for JJ Redick and Jared Dudley. Actually, Redick and Dudley were pretty good fits, but could they gotten more for Bledsoe than they did? Who's obviously blossomed into a pretty good star in Phoenix. Almost losing DeAndre Jordan to the Mavericks, so they ended up making that one work. Then later trading Jared Dudley and giving away a first round pick and basically a salary up because they had kind of screwed up where they were salary wise. Matt Barnes and Spencer Hawes. Barnes we obviously made fun of, but he was important to the team for Lance Stevenson, and then turning around Stevenson and a first round pick for Jeff Green, who they made.
Yeah, that's probably never a good idea.
Yeah,
anytime you trade for Jeff Green, it's probably a bad idea. So.
Yeah. Trading for Austin Rivers, that one's kind of arguable because he's ended up becoming better, and they didn't really give up much to get him. But obviously, the optics of Doc Rivers trading for his son not that great, and maybe some personality-wise thing that maybe not helping the locker room chemistry. And then there's always been the jokes about them signing former Celtics or playoff opponents from 2008 to 2011. But the guys they've had there: Josh Smith, Glenn Davis, Nate Robinson, Jordan Farmar, Sasha Vujicic, Paul Pierce, Danny Granger, Hedo Turkoglu, Chuck Hayes, Darren Collison, and Steven Jackson. And not all those guys, necessarily were bad. Some of them were fine, but just that mentality of going after those guys and not really, being able to hit on many complementary players, especially young guys, has been, I think pretty much their undoing. You look at what, how the Thunder developed players during that time, how the Spurs developed players during that time, how the Warriors developed players during that time, and those teams, the Thunder obviously lost Durant, but those other teams have been successful because they've been able to kind of, get guys off the scrap heap or draft rookies and, make them into stars. Mm-hmm. That is the Clippers not been able to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think we should move on to the next team on our list.
Yeah, so the next team we have is the Dallas Mavericks, the 2001 to 2005 Dallas Mavericks. During this period, they went had a winning percentage of 68.3% with a 5.53 SRS. So a really good team. Signature players, of course, Dirk Nowitzki at the top, Steve Nash, Michael Finley, Sean Bradley, and quite a few others in there too. But those kind of, I would say, are the big four, particularly Dirk, Nash, and Finley. But best chance at a championship. We had talked about with the Clippers and what their best chance were. The Mavericks, and people kind of forget this too. 2003, they started the season 14-0. That was at the time 1 game short of the NBA record by the 94 Rockets. Of course, that's been usurped quite a bit. The first 60-win season in franchise history that year. Dirk arguably making the leap into superstardom. He was kind of budding here and there and really getting there. I think 2003 was the year where everybody kind of said, okay, this guy is a bona fide superstar. This guy is great. The Mavericks, they make it to the Western Conference Finals. finals. They have 2 7-game series, so it's not easy to get there, but they get there, as much as they can. And they gave the Spurs all they could handle, but they lost in 6 games. What was interesting is Dirk got knocked out of that series in game 3. So they still kind of went toe to toe with the Spurs, even without Dirk or whatever. So you have to imagine and sort of putting on your philosophically or whatever, or, kind of pie in the sky, had Dirk not been hurt, it's very plausible they reached the NBA Finals in that series. I think they could probably have beat the Spurs there. I don't know. Who knows? We don't know. But hypothetically, very good chance they could have at least, contended more than they did, or not lost in 6 games, maybe make it a 7-game series or whatever. But then the real issue becomes, okay, then they make it to the NBA Finals, they get out of the West. Could they have beat the Nets then? And I think absolutely they could have beat the Nets that year. So it's a little interesting to know that in 2003, there's a chance that, the Dallas Mavericks are your NBA champions and not the San Antonio Spurs. So just interesting how those things can go there. If Dirk doesn't get hurt, what happens there. As far as this franchise, though, then the failures kind of came immediately after this. Following that season, the Mavericks, they traded for Anton Jameson and Antoine Walker. This helped turn the team into one of the best, the NBA's best offenses. I mean, you add those 2 dudes to a team that was already a very good offense. They were great offense, but their defense struggled quite a lot. And then, under Don Nelson, that became a little bit of a laughingstock. Where that 2003, they were pretty decent blend of, offense and defense. You lose, Rafe LaFrentz and a few other bigger dudes, and you bring in Anton Jameson and Anton Walker. Your defense is going to suffer, and it absolutely did. And that year, they were knocked out by the Kings in the first round. Then other notable failures, of course, letting Steve Nash leave in free agency. Then, the 2005 Western Conference semis, they lose to Steve Nash and his rising Phoenix Suns. And then, if we extend it a little bit out of that 2005, but look at, kind of that franchise in general, make it to the NBA Finals in 2006, blow a 2-0 lead and a great chance to make it 3-0-2. They were definitely in control of that game too. And had they made it a 3-0, I mean, it seems implausible that they would have lost the series, but they blew game 3 as it was. And then Dwayne Wade broke out in a huge way. And then, of course, you lose the NBA Finals that year. And then you can extend it even a little bit after that. The next season they come back and they're great. Then they lose in the first round of the Golden State Warriors. And then there's a lot of issues. Of course, like you're saying, unlike the Clippers or as far as we know for the Clippers right now, the Mavericks were able to turn around and, win a title in 2011. But, that was a bunch of, issues they had there. And as far as different moves they made and stuff. The big thing is losing Nash in free agency, I think, was huge. And also the trade of Anton Jameson, or the trade for Anton Jameson and Antoine Walker really just kind of changed the whole dynamic of a team that was right there. And you wonder if they had just came back the next year and said, okay, we got this team. Let's go with it. They didn't. They kind of toiled around with it and ended up not working. And then real quickly though, teams that kind of got in their way, and then you look at, what they were dealing with in terms of the West, it was interesting because the Sacramento Kings always gave them trouble. And it was the Weber, Peja, Vlade, Bibby Kings that always gave them trouble. But otherwise in the West, there wasn't a whole lot of consistent contenders. They were able to kind of get through the Minnesota Timberwolves relatively easy. But the Spurs were kind of always in their way. Later when Nash leaves, the Suns get in their way. And then of course you get to the NBA Finals, the Miami Heat are in your way. But a lot of times it was just the Kings or something weird would get in the way of the Mavericks. But definitely a team that I think optics different than the Clippers, because I feel like it was a team that was still felt like it was growing, whereas right now we have the Clippers and it feels like that's kind of it. I don't know if there was this immediate doom for the Mavericks after 2005. Then again, you let Steve Nash go and it looks like, okay, things are kind of unwavering here and they're kind of getting loose, and Dirk's a choker in the playoffs, quote unquote, doesn't play D. So I guess the optics were a little bit that way, but that's the Dallas Mavericks, our second team on our list here.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously the Lakers were the top team during that time. For most of that time that we're talking about with Dallas, they didn't play in the playoffs, but they were obviously on top of their, that Western Conference was really tough. I mean, the Timberwolves, even though Dallas handled them pretty easily, they were a tough team. The Trailblazers were still kind of at the end of being a tough team. I mean, really, I think 2003 is almost the peak of just all these tough teams in the Western Conference. Kind of that top 5 and 6 being all really awesome teams, and the the Spurs kind of emerging from that. But it's easy enough to see that the Mavericks could have done that in had they not lost Dirk in game 3. And I mean they probably ended up working out for the better for them, with even though the moves for Jameson and Walker weren't smart and losing Nash, that ended up being able to kind of rebuild the team around Dirk and then having that great success later, the 06 finals, the 2011 championship. So probably, going in that direction ended up being, good for long term, getting them a championship, and they could have won it in a different way maybe, but they definitely could have not. So you always take a certain one over an uncertain one. So, but yeah, they did sort of, they took a winding path to get there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little bit longer, but speaking of winding paths,
yes, the Milwaukee Bucks. So between 1981 and 1987, the Bucks averaged a 6.66 winning percentage with a 5.76 SRS. That's actually a better SRS than the Lakers had during that stretch. And of course, they won. I guess they won 3 championships during that time. Yeah, they won 3 championships during that time, and then went to a couple other finals. So that's a pretty. It kind of shows you how much tougher the East was during that time than the West. The Lakers generally did not have to go through tough teams, especially later on in the 80s. They dealt with some pretty tough Sonics and Suns teams in the early 80s, but once kind of they emerged, 83, 84, that competition was not generally that tough for them, except for inexplicably the Rockets beating them in 86.
Right, yeah, right.
But meanwhile, as we're going to talk about, the Bucks kept having to go through Celtics and 76ers teams and just, were unable to emerge from that. Signature players, they actually had a big trade that kind of split things off, and we'll talk about that in particular. But Sidney Moncrief was there, basically the whole time. For the early part of the run, it was Marcus Johnson, Bob Lanier, and Junior Bridgman, who actually did return briefly in 87. Later part of the run, the key guys were Paul Pressey, Terry Cummings, and Ricky Pierce, and some other guys who were there for most or all of that time. Alton Lister, Paul McKeskey, Harvey Catchings, Craig Hodges, and Randy Brewer. Probably the best chance at a championship was right at the beginning, right at the end. They lost by 1 in Game 7 to the Sixers in the second round. That year they won 60 games. And in 87, they were a 50-win team, but a tough 50-win team. They took the Celtics to 7 games in a tight second-round series. And then they would have, if they'd won that series, they would have had to battle the Pistons in the conference finals, which was probably tossed up at that point. So obviously the Pistons were probably a bit of a better team, but they were good. I mean, like I said, they were they had high 50s win totals for a lot of that time and were extremely tough.
Yeah, and I wonder. I would have loved to have seen a matchup between those two, in the primes, because I think what was always great about Milwaukee is they just had length too, and I do wonder if their length and athleticism would have matched up pretty well with the Pistons, and maybe they would have been able to easily beat, or not easily beat, but more easily get past the Pistons versus once you slayed the beasts of the Celtics and the Sixers or whatever, the Pistons might have been a better matchup for them, but unfortunately they could never slay the beast of the Celtics or the Sixers, so we don't know. So
yeah, and the year they really, the 2 years they peaked were probably 80, 81, and 86. In 86, they just happened to be an awesome team the same year. The Celtics were even, a better team. They ended up sweeping them in the playoffs. But most years, they had an 8.69 SRS. That's championship quality level on most seasons. So that was definitely, the timing was bad for them. The most notable changes, September 84, they traded Junior Bridgman, Harvey Catchings, and Marcus Johnson to the Clippers for Terry Cummings, Craig Hodges, Ricky Pierce, all the guys the Bucks got back were younger. Cummings was an emerging superstar. Marcus Johnson actually was 28 and seemed like he had been a huge star and seemed like he was on track for a Hall of Fame career, and then injuries caught up with him. So it ended up being a much worse trade than it looked at the time. But
yeah, that was a hell of a trade though, in terms of just here's a bunch of guys that are good, and here's a bunch of guys that are good here. That's nobody's really thrown in that trade, which is pretty cool. It's every single person there's got some benefit or some value. So it's always fun to see trades like that. We don't get those anymore, unfortunately.
Absolutely, yeah. And then 86, Alton Lister was, along with 2 draft picks, one of which became Mark Jackson, was traded to the Sonics for Jack Sickman, a couple second-round picks. So that sort of keyed, this is a bit outside of our scope, but that keyed the later 80s years, which 87 and 89, they were still, a pretty strong team until Cummings finally was traded to the Spurs. But, I would say, really, other than 85, which oddly they were swept by the 76ers despite being the superior regular season team, that was kind of during a time which Barkley was really coming on, and they were kind of starting to play at a higher level after 84 had been a disappointment. but every other playoff loss, which happened to the Celtics 3 times and the Sixers 3 other times, was to a better team. So all 7 of those years, they either lost to the Celtics or the 76ers, which is just, it's kind of hard to what can you do? I mean, they were, I think we at some point need to get, we've talked about it, I think a few times, but we need to get even more into this team. But that's really a remarkable team, with the kind of the style of play that they had. They were coached by Don Nelson. They were, up tempo. They had more of a, point forward offense with, Paul Pressey, in particular, kind of running the offense. It was, not traditional with the, guards doing a lot of the playmaking. I mean, they obviously did some, but it was a different kind of offense, especially for the time. They were not, they did shoot some outside, not like crazy like the things we get later, but for the time they were, more open style. So they really did do some influential, interesting things. I know, a good surface level amount of them, but there's definitely reading that I could do to learn more, in depth about what they've got going on. But definitely a team worth exploring more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely just need to do like a series or just like one big show about them, because I'd love to learn more and dig in a little bit more. This was a nice little treat, but it only fueled the flames for me of like, man, this team is so cool. And you look at that like graph of just like, man, the entire 80s, they were great. And then like even into the early 90s, you forget that like they were still a reputable team.
Okay.
They weren't like, they probably were past their, window or whatever, but still like, you were still almost winning 50 games in like 1991, which is crazy. Because the team fell on such hard times then in the 90s. So it seems like so long ago too that like the Bucks were that superpower or whatever, but they were. I mean, they were just a superpower that just couldn't get past two particular teams and two teams that really stood the test of time. So it sucks because the Bucks have unfortunately been lost to time because of that, and they shouldn't, because they were a remarkable team for a lot of years.
Yeah, even in between 80 and 91, they were still above a 600, and they were above 4 SRS. So I mean, that's a really long stretch. Even like 78, 79, they were a pretty good team there. They were coming on during that time. They had Marcus Johnson and got Sidney Moncrief, and started. That's really when that run kind of started.
Yeah,
so
and that's that 86 team having like an 8 9 SRS. I mean, it's nuts. Like that's crazy. Like that should win you an NBA championship. But
most years it would. Yeah, exactly. So.
All right, and then the last team on our big list here is the San Antonio Spurs, 2008 to 2012, which is kind of interesting. I didn't think of this team, but then looking back, it's interesting that they're remarkably ordinary for a team that had seemed so extraordinary for so long, the San Antonio Spurs. During this period, they had a 68.8 win percentage and a 5.25 SRS, but as far as the playoffs, it's really weird. 2008, they make it to the Western Conference Finals. 2009, they lose in the first round. 2010, they make it to the semifinals. 2011, they lose in the first round yet again, and then 2012 they make it to the Western Conference Finals. But those few years squeeze in there, 09, 10, and 11, I kind of forget that like they were just like a team that bowed out. Like they first round exits and then semifinal exits. Squeezed in there, of course, Western Conference Finals runs, and squeezed in there are really good, win total seasons. But we do kind of forget that they had a little bit of a rough patch there. Signature players, I mean, obviously you know who these people are: Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker. You get Kawhi Leonard a little bit in the back end of this, but for the most part, and this is a big reason why there probably wasn't prolonged success there, is the team had gotten old there for a while. It had built around those three for so long, but then the role players had been mostly like older guys. We'll get to them here in a little bit, but definitely probably played a part in that. Best shot at a championship, 2012 team. That year they had the NBA's top offense. They seemed poised for finals appearance before the Thunder, years before anybody thought they were ready to really compete on that level, upsets them in 6 games and makes it to the NBA Finals. This, of course, is Harden, is Durant, is Westbrook, way ahead of schedule from when people thought the Thunder would really get there. Probably maybe 2 years, I would say, ahead of when most people kind of thought. But a real surprise team, a team that just kind of blew the doors off the Spurs, and it went really interesting as well, because, of course, the Thunder then face off against the Heat. And had things went a little bit differently. We're looking at the potential of 3 straight Big 3 Heat versus Spurs finals matchups instead of, the Thunder squeezing in there in that one year. Notable failures, I'd say 2010 swept in 4 games by the Suns in the Western Conference Finals, Western Conference semifinals rather. And this was not the D'Antoni Suns. This was after this. This was the Alvin Gentry Suns, who were really a year away from imploding. Like the next season, I think they would only win 40 games or 41 games or whatever. But in this particular case, they were able to sweep the Spurs. And then the 2011 Spurs win 61 games, but then are upset in the first round by the Grizzlies, which was an amazing series, one of my favorite series of all time. But yeah, this was this year where, the Spurs seem like they're poised to make a deep run, and they get bounced out really quickly. In terms of notable roster changes, there wasn't that much, and that's probably one of the issues. They acquired Richard Jefferson in 2009, which was nice because they had a little bit of wing presence to them. But otherwise, it was really a parade of veterans for a long amount of time. I mean, you had guys like Theo Ratliff, Michael Finley, Kurt Thomas, Antonio McDyess, Steven Jackson, Boris Diaw, Matt Bonner. You had a lot of just guys that would come in, sort of, fill in a gap for a year, and then they were out, and fill in a gap for a year, and they were out. And it didn't have the prolonged, sustained success that really the Spurs were known for. Of course, one of the biggest roster moves that helped them now the next few years get sustained success and win a championship, of course, trading George Hill for Kawhi Leonard at the time, a move that a lot of people looked at with a curious eye, because George Hill had been a great player, and Greg Popovich mentioned that he was one of his favorite players on the team, but they went with a project here in Kawhi Leonard, and that obviously worked out quite well for them. As far as great teams in their way, I think a lot of it was just the budding super teams that had kind of come up. At this time, you have the Lakers. Of course, in the early part of this, the Kobe, Paul Gasol, Ron Artest, Andrew Bynum, Lamar Odom Lakers. You have the Mavericks sort of emerging, the Dirk, Jason Terry, Jason Kidd ones that would eventually win the championship. The Suns, the latter parts of the Suns kind of dynasty with Steve Nash at his powers and Amari Stoudemire before he left. And then, of course, the Thunder, who kind of came as a surprise in the later half of this, the Harden, Westbrook, Durant team coming a little bit. And then, of course, you have the Miami Heat in the East. But the West is very competitive in this period, and the Spurs just probably didn't. The roster build was probably not the best for this team. They had kind of relied on Duncan being what he was, and Parker being what he was, and Ginobili being what he was. But as Ginobili lost a step, they were a little slow to replace him. But of course, when you bring in Kawhi Leonard, then Ginobili was able to move to kind of the fourth role in there, and then they were able to get a little bit younger in terms of the role players they got. Guys like a Danny Green, they were able to bring in and really stretch the floor a little bit more and help. A Patty Mills is a guy that I look at too. That getting more younger and more athletic in your bench and in your rotation probably helped them get to the finals the year after this, and then win the NBA Finals the year after this as well, and then you have sustained success for the next few years after this. So, but yeah, kind of interesting. I never kind of thought of this period of the Spurs, but yeah, they were just kind of there for a lot of it.
Yeah, and obviously they won championships beforehand. They would win another,
right. So it's sandwiched between like a tremendous success, and like I'm saying, this is like an ordinary run for them, but they made two, Western Conference Finals, so it's not really. But those years there, bouncing out in the first round, it seems kind of unique. It seems like because it seems like you're just always the Spurs. You're just always kind of there. It's like the Western Conference semis. You're like, there's the Spurs, and we're here again this year, and there's the Spurs. So, but yeah, just kind of some ordinariness by their standards for a few years.
Yeah, every year it was kind of like, oh, okay, this is about to be. This is nice for the Spurs, but this is about to be the end. Duncan's going to be too old, and they come back and have great seasons and win championships and make finals and all that. Yeah, that 2012 year with the Thunder, they had won like 20 straight games between the playoffs and the end of the season, and. They beat the Thunder pretty easily in those first two games. You thought, oh, this series is over, and then the Thunder just turned it on and completely obliterated them. And then and obviously, kind of what happened from there. But yeah, they. I would say the other big move you mentioned Diaw, but I think he was really important for them.
Yeah.
He came along at the end and really was able to be another kind of big playmaker and competent defender. He obviously made LeBron work at times and things like that. So I mean,
Matt Bonner too. He was a great floor spacer during that time. Yeah, we don't give enough credit to Matt Bonner, but you look at his numbers, and it's nuts how good that guy was in a Spurs uniform. Just like
just in that role, we perfect for that role. Absolutely, yeah.
I think I'm looking at 40 between 2008 and 2012. He hit 41% of his threes. That's going to work. That's man.
So here's a few honorable mentions. So these teams, they averaged above 600 for 5 or more seasons, but they did not necessarily finish above that level each year. And they also did not make the finals during that period. So teams that never made the finals, the Kings of the early 2000s, of course, with Stojakovic, Chris Webber, Vlade Divac, Doug Christie. The Bulls of the early 70s with Chet Walker, Bob Love, Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Leer. The Suns of the late 2000s, Steve Nash, Amari Stoudemire, Sean Marion. All those teams were above a 4 SRS. And Then below them, this is in order of SRS. So basically, kind of talking about the order of quality of teams as we're going down. The Hawks of the late 90s, or excuse me, the late 80s, Dominic Wilkins, Doc Rivers, Cliff Livingston, Kevin Willis. And then, assuming they missed the finals, this would be the Rockets of the last 5 years. They are above 612 and a 3.75 SRS. So interesting that that's not a team I would have necessarily thought of during that time. But James Harden has been that transformative for them. Obviously Patrick Beverley's been around. Dwight Howard was there for a couple years. Trevor Reeves as well. Coming along late. But yeah, that's really it's been Harden and a supporting cast kind of around him. So the mid 90s Cavs, Mark Price, Brad Doherty, Hot Rod Williams, Terrell Brandon. And this was an interesting one. From 96 to 03, the Blazers, they were 3.56 SRS. And they changed around quite a bit, but they did have Rasheed Wallace pretty much that whole time, Sabonis pretty much that whole time, Damon Stoudemire for a lot of that team. So they did have some, obviously, common players. But yeah, they
I would have thought they were a blip. Yeah, I thought they would have been like 99 to 2002 or whatever, and that'd be. But yeah, 96 stretching it back all the way there is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The late 90s Heat from 06 to 2001, Alonzo Mourning, Tim Hardaway, PJ Brown, Dan Marley. The mid 90s Hawks, Mookie Blaylock, Steve Smith, Dikembe Mutombo, Christian Laettner. The 2005-2013 Nuggets. Of course, Carmelo for most of that, except for the last couple of years, but they still kind of kept it going. Nene, Marcus Camby, Chauncey Billups for a couple of years, but I think the two best years that they had during that stretch included the 09 Conference Finals. Minnesota Timberwolves of the early 2000s, of course, Kevin Garnett being by far the most important, Wally Szczerbiak, Terrell Brandon, Sam Cassell as well. The late 2000s Jazz, Darren Williams, Mehmet Okur, Carlos Boozer, Andre Karolinko. And then a couple teams that were low in the SRS but high enough in the winning percentage. The Grizzlies, this is 2011 through 2016. If you include the 2017 season, they fall just below 600, but very, very close to that. But any way you put it, it's right around there. Of course, Marc Gasol, Mike Conley, Zach Randolph, and Tony Allen, only a 2.15 SRS. And we've talked about, I think, on the show for some reasons why the SRS may underrate them slightly. And then the Bulls of 2009 through 2015 as well. They're buoyed really by a couple of really strong seasons when Derrick Rose was healthy, Joakim Noah, Luol Deng, and Taj Gibson as well. So those are as far as the never made finals teams, those are the ones that kind of stand out.
Absolutely. And then made finals just before or soon after a few other teams here. The Thunder, of course, of the late 2000s. We're still going on here with a little bit with this.
Mid 2000s, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Exactly. Yeah. Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Serge Ibaka, Steven Adams, of course, 649 win percentage, a 5.30 SRS. The Sonics of the the early 90s, rather. Sean Kemp, Gary Payton, Michael Cage, Nate McMillan, of course. The Spurs of the early 90s as well, 1990 to 1996. David Robinson, Sean Elliott, Terry Cummings, Avery Johnson. Then the Jazz. It's kind of a little bit of an interesting one here because you kind of break it down a little bit. You got 87 to 96, and that was a team that won 635 win percentage, and then a 4.06 SRS. That's Karl Malone, John Stockton, Mark Eaton, Thurl Bailey, Jeff Hornacek, and then of course you get the peak there, 1992 to 1996, and that team definitely makes another leap. Then you got a 659 win percentage, and then a 7.05 SRS. So that was clearly their peak there, but it did go on for quite a few years before that too, which we've talked about on the show too. That was a team that had success beyond when most people kind of think they did. The Celtics, believe it or not, the late 80s, early 90s Celtics, kind of the dying days, but they were still, pretty competitive there. Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Larry Bird, Reggie Lewis, of course. The Suns of the late 70s, early 80s, the Walter Davis, Alvin Adams, Paul Westphal, Dennis Johnson Suns. The Jazz of the late 2000s, kind of the last gasp of Karl Malone, John Stockton, and Byron Russell. Then you got the Lakers of the late 90s, the Eddie Jones, Shaquille O'Neal, Nick Van Exel, Elton Campbell Lakers, right before Kobe had really ascended to superstardom, and they kind of filled the role players around those guys, the veteran role players around those guys moved out. Eddie Jones and Nick Van Exel, of course. And then the late 90s Sonics, 1997 to 2001, Gary Payton, Detlef Schrempf, Hersey Hawkins, Vin Baker. So the post Sean Kemp Sonics, who were still a very good team that people kind of forget as well, and were super competitive even after Sean Kemp departed. The mid 90s Suns, the Jason Kidd, Kevin Williams, Charles Barkley, Cliff Robinson. This team went under a few different transformations during this point, of course, with Charles Barkley moving on when he did, and Jason Kidd kind of taking over the helm for quite a few years as well until he would move on as well. But yeah, that team, and then the early 90s Knicks, 1989 to 1993, these Knicks, Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, Mark Jackson, and John Stark. So quite a few teams that would either make a final, just before this period or soon after. But definitely a great list there of some more teams.
Yeah, the 94 to 01 Suns, I think, were interesting there because Kevin Johnson was really the only guy who was there basically the whole time.
Right,
yeah. Talked about Barkley was there early, Kidd was there later, Cliff Robinson was there later. It was kind of hard to find signature players from that team because they change around so much. But yeah, I forgot how long they lasted as a good team. Even after the 93 finals.
Right,
so,
and the Suns are a remarkable team. If you go back and look at their history, they haven't really been bad that many times.
Until now, right?
Yeah, and now is the first time of really prolonged, of the team being as bad as it is, because even you're talking about 2001 after Kidd moves on and they get Starberry or whatever, it's only a few years later then until Nash comes, and then it's oh, okay, cool, now we're good again. So they've really been able to be lucky, and even in the 70s and 80s, that was a competitive team for many, many years. I mean, you have a little period in the late 80s, but otherwise they've been a playoff team, more than they haven't, and then the last 6 or 7 years has not been good. So it's definitely a unique thing going on in Phoenix right now. But yeah, otherwise, by and large, it's a really successul franchise that maybe people don't talk about nearly enough. I mean, all through the 80s and all through the late 70s as a playoff team. So
yeah, that Jazz team, obviously the 87 through 96 stretch and that peak that you mentioned, but also the 99 through 03 team as well that that you mentioned. I mean, the fact that they have two stretches surrounding that 97, 98 finals appearances, the fact that Malone and Stockton lasted that long.
Yeah, Malone got an MVP, I think, in 1999 or whatever, which is the weirdest MVP ever. It's really, Karl Malone? MVP in 1999? But yeah, he did. It was a team that was able to kind of weather the storm a little bit after those years. But yeah, it's squeezed in between those finals are just really a lot of good seasons too. And we always talk about those early 90s Jazz teams just do not get enough credit as well. I mean, there's a very, real possibility that the Jazz make the finals in 1992 and we get, a Jordan, Malone, Stockton battle then. But yeah, that was a team that was just loaded. And even 1994, I believe, made it to the conference finals as well.
Yeah, I mean they would have made the regular list if it hadn't have just happened to be 1 year. I think it was 93 where they happened to be down a little bit in regular season record, where they just couldn't quite qualify for the Clippers thing. But they were definitely the closest to that. I mean, they're
looking at this
to the
now.
Bucks.
I mean, they have a plus 600 win percentage in 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you got 1993, like you mentioned, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So yeah, they would have had 13 seasons of a plus 60 win percentage in a row, right, if not for that one little blip, and they were at 57.3 that year. So
yeah, exactly.
Damn,
so, right.
Damn it, Sloan.
Very good. Yes,
get on your guys. Let's go.
Yeah, that was the problem. He wasn't on them enough.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Jerry Sloan, always known as the the players coach,
softy. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Just couldn't get on these guys at this time.
Yeah,
so
yes.
Come on, Jeff Malone, let's go. Get out there.
Yeah,
David Benoit, let's go.
Right, exactly. So, anything else before we go, Rich?
No, that's Clippers. My guess is they will not be adding another year to this list after this year. But we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what this offseason holds for them. But yeah, I think just give it an idea that they've been a very good team for a lot of years. And even though the failure kind of surrounds this tenure of the Clippers, it still is remarkable what they were able to do and how consistent they were able to be over these last handful of years. So just trying to give some light to that.
All right, well, thanks everyone for checking us out. You can find us at Fansided at stepback@fansided.com, and you can also leave us a rating and review if you like what we're doing on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. Pretty much, we're there. You can also follow us on Twitter at OverandBackNBA, and also like us on Facebook. We would greatly appreciate that. So, thanks for listening, and we're back again soon.